All right, welcome everybody to this, our first MetaShift installment brought to you guys by Nagrid and myself on behalf of Monolith Duelyst. And today we are going to be focusing a little bit on the latest change that has hit us here in Duelyst world, the Mask of Shadows nerf. We've got the Scientist and Protohype on with us today. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hola.
Uh,
Pleasure to be
both
here.
of these both of these gentlemen have played an extensive amount of Songhai, and Proto, I'm looking at you. I'm looking at you. Those 20 ribbons.
21, thanks.
Yeah. But who's counting, right?
I am
But who's
counting.
counting, right?
Yeah.
Thanks for being on the show, guys. We just
Thanks
thought
for having
it
us.
would be really great to get some of your input on how you felt about the nerf and what effect you think it has on Songhai in the current meta game. And as a bonus, at the end of the show, we're going to get a prediction here from Proto about where he thinks we're going to be heading with the next big patch that's also just been announced. And we're going to get some other interesting insights from Nick as well. So let's kick it off, guys. I think we'll start here with Scientist first. What was your first impression when you heard about the Mask of Shadows nerf?
Well, let's remind the viewers too what the exact change was. It went from +2 attack and backstab 4 to just backstab 4. And my initial impressions are that it made the card obviously much less powerful in and of its own right, and that it weakened a lot of other cards in the class, particularly Cyclone Mask and anything that is essentially positionally relevant, since a fear of being backstabbed is no longer such a constant threat.
Proto, what was your initial reaction?
It's funny. I had been a little bit MIA the last couple weeks. I had some other stuff to do IRL, and the game had become a little bit more stable, comfortable. So I wanted to take a break and not burn out super hard. Wanted to get a good second wind going, if you will. So I found out about it a couple days ago, and I was kind of shocked. It kind of hit me out of left field. I thought someone was trolling me at first because we had already seen so much stuff get changed, and I was like, okay, this is fine. And then they were like, no, I'm serious. And I was like, all right. So I went and looked it up, and oh man, a whole 2 damage knocked off of an artifact at the same cost and the same effect. It was pretty brutal. It was like somebody rang the bell in a boxing match, and then you just got sucker punched from behind. You had no idea what was happening. I don't know. I feel like it was a bit unnecessary off the top, just at a first glance, especially because
why would you say that is? I mean, you say you felt it was unnecessary. There are some players who were obviously rejoicing when they heard about the nerf, especially non-Songhai players or those guys who had gotten really salty over eating a couple of Mask of Shadows to the back and losing that way. But you say you felt it was kind of unnecessary. Why?
Yeah, among the upper echelon of the competitive crowd, I had never heard a complaint like that. It usually came from the middle of the road player that was getting into the game and trying to make their name in the duelist world, and they didn't quite understand all of the positional nuances of each class yet. And especially against Songhai, Mask of Shadows is really the only thing, backstab wise, that you have to worry about now. Before that wasn't really the case. Gorehorn was still a thing. We still had, Kaido was on the ups and hadn't quite been shot down yet. And there were a lot of things that you could do with your positional advantage that weren't Mask of Shadows. And now, especially recently, we've definitely weeded out those cards as more relevant, or have weeded them out to be less relevant now. And people don't think they're good enough, and for good reason. And it just felt like taking away the last remaining. It was like the Vitruvian nerf to me. Not to say that the Third Wish shouldn't have been nerfed or whatever, and all that good stuff, but that identity that Vitruvian had to get to that certain curve where they would have their class identity come to fruition. You would really feel Vitruvian when you were playing against it, and it felt like that was Songhai's last remaining thing, and it's now just not a thing anymore. So I was really hoping that they wouldn't do anything past that, but I get why they're doing it. It makes total sense to me. It's just a bit unfortunate as a Songhai main to like hear those things and like know that the class isn't as good as people are saying it is, and then the sledgehammer comes down like way after the bell. I don't know. So that was like my first impression of it.
So, scientist, it makes me curious. Let's look at one part of this. You mentioned and Proto was talking about it as well, how this changes positioning when one plays against Songhai. When one looks at this nerf, could you say that one is greater than the other in terms of which is more of a pain to lose as a Songhai player? Is it the fact that players are now being able to position more aggressively, or this 2 attack change? Because we really need to touch on this 2 attack that was taken off. Why is this so crippling potentially for a Songhai player outside of just the positioning and a player having to play around being backstabbed? How does this lack of 2 attack actually really damage the faction?
Oh, it makes an absolute massive difference. I mean, when before you would say, oh, it's a strictly better Staff of Ykir. Now, to me, for it to even like be on the power level of a Staff of Ykir, you have to be backstabbing with it like 50% of the time, right? If you think about the +4 instead of the +2, and yes, you negate the 2 damage and you don't lose 1 charge, but as far as actual damage dealt, which is really what you as the Songhai player care about most, you have to be like 50% of the uses have to be hitting and backstab. And furthermore, another strength that came from the previous Mask of Shadows, the +2 attack, if the opponent wanted to remove it aggressively, which usually they have to do with minions in their face, Rustcrawler was certainly not a common thing on the ladder, then that's additional damage that their general has to take. The 4 attack is a big threshold for basically all minions that are 4 cost or less are going to die to that attack, particularly Emerald Rejuvenator throws itself in. Any Healing Mystic, Primus Fist, any of these things, even if they're buffed a little bit, are just dead to that attack. So when you think about the fact that the opponent has to take a bunch of face damage, which they already don't want to be attacking your general, when you are the Songhai player, and they have to trade in their entire board, which is gonna allow you to get additional value from things like Tuskboar, and if you are able to develop a board, get lots of positive trades or get buffs off like Killing Edge. So the +2 attack was actually a massive component to the Mask of Shadows itself, in addition to its synergy with Cyclone Mask, because at 4 attack, again, it would kill off any of those 2 drops. It would kill off an Emerald Rejuvenator if you were able to combine them. But now, just dealing those 2, it's not worthwhile to equip a Cyclone Mask and a Mask of Shadows. It's just too. It's already a significant tempo loss if you don't get immediate value from equipping a mask when it gets destroyed, and now the potential of actually getting enough value to justify its play is statistically so unlikely as to not even warrant consideration of the card.
Yeah, Nagert, you
Also,
got something to say here.
One of my first impressions here was like the trading potential of Mask, which is like after the nerf, it's not there anymore. You can't aggressively trade with Mask without backstabbing. It's just another thing anymore. Whereas before you could aggressively trade off Emerald Rejuvenators, for example, on your own, and clear board again to establish task boards and accomplishing to have them stick on the board for the turn to actually get them back, or have them trade their face into your minions again instead of their minions. So that's obviously a thing that the 2 attack nerf of Mask of Shadows made that's just not a thing anymore that you can trade yourself. That was my first impression on that.
So, I mean, this then brings us on to the present song highs that we're seeing on ladder. Things have changed. I mean, you you would think that changing one card as pivotal as Mask of Shadows was to a minion-based Songhai strategy, even a spell/artifact strategy with Songhai, you'd think that you would still be able to have people pursuing that kind of archetype, despite the lack of Mask of Shadows. But what we've seen almost immediately toward more spell-heavy variants. Proto, what do you think about that? Would you agree or disagree with me if I told you that a lot of players are feeling that that is the more, and had been becoming the more consistent version of Songhai in the last week or two, even pre-patch?
Becoming more consistent by necessity, or like nature of the nerfs would probably be accurate, but I wouldn't call it like an outwardly consistent strategy, like in and of itself, like in a vacuum. It's I never liked the hybrid decks that were trying to like break Mana Vortex and Blood Rage Mask, especially without Mask of Shadows now. I don't know how that would work out. Like intrinsically, when I think about how spell decks were winning the game before, through like Mask of Shadows damage or what have you, with Ranged Mask, it feels like that kind of nerf hurts Spellheim more than it would hurt a minion based deck. Maybe that's not true with juxtaposition and whatnot, but I feel like it's as bad, if not worse, for the spell decks. And like I was never everyone who's ever watched my stream or whatever has heard me go on about the how just notoriously awful like those deck lists look, the hybrid ones that people talk about. I mean, it's certainly it's a playable deck, but everything that I know about deck building and like in CCGs and everything else, and like what that deck is trying to do, and like the combinations of cards you have to like filter your hand through to get to that point where you can end the game, just looks utterly ridiculous to me on paper. Like every game, I don't understand. Like I don't know. People made it work. It's pretty good apparently. So maybe that's what we have to go with. Again, by necessity, that may become the front running like variant in the faction, just because our minions are so bad now, like comparatively speaking to other classes. Maybe that has to become a thing. But I would have never, like pre-Mask of Shadows nerf, ever considered playing a deck that looked like that.
Okay. So, Scientist, what's your take on it? I mean, you've seen what's been happening to Songhai, and I'm sure you've been doing a fair amount of testing yourself. What's your take on it? Because I'm going to take a wild guess here, but I think your take is going to be a little bit different than Proto's. So I think the viewers would love to hear what you have to say.
My views are very similar to Proto's. I don't hold the spell high or the hybrid lists in particularly high regard. Largely because they're just too inconsistent to be played at the highest level. And they'll do well, across the mid ranks, and you'll see a number of people in the top 50 at the end of the season who are playing primarily spell high. But conceptually, the deck, as Proto stated, the foundation upon which it's built is just not something that is going to translate to success against every different faction. And I'll explain specifically what I mean by that. So when you look at the composition of the deck, it has certain particularly powerful cards on their own, which is necessary for the absolute strongest desk. You have Tuskspore, you have Lantern Fox, you have Inner Focus, which is still standalone very good. I actually believe Blood Rage Mask is one of the more overpowered cards at the moment, because for 1 mana, it will typically represent, we'll say, on the order of 3 damage. We'll say on average you can get off probably 3 damage with that. Sometimes it's a little bit less. Sometimes you just get 1 or 2 spells off because you didn't have the right cards, and sometimes you get much more than that. When you consider it in this manner, that's a 1 mana cheaper Phoenix Fire spread out over a couple turns. Okay, that's not too bad. The additional benefit comes in that it forces, oftentimes, the opponent to be attacking your face, which is something you as the Songhai player want to be encouraging. It's a lot of what made the previous Mask of Shadows, any artifact in the Songhai faction, that is a powerful benefit. And now you don't have to, have a massive tempo loss when you spend 3 mana just to get a ranged artifact that dies next turn, because now you've just spent 1 mana and still had the ability to play other cards, to develop, to not commit your entire turn to just playing this one card. That said, the deck is composed of far too many situational cards, and cards that rely on being ahead on board. So like when you can hide a Mana Forger in the corner, when you can hide a Four Winds in the corner, that's great. Those are going to get, those are going to represent not only a lot of damage, they'll represent some healing, and it's always been an effective strategy from the inception of Spell High when it was made in the alpha, back when Heaven's Eclipse was
2 mana?
2 mana,
Yes.
which was ridiculous. Or no, I'm sorry, it was 3 mana. It was 3 mana because it's 4 now.
It was
right?
3. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So
2 mana
which was
Eclipse would be
which was also
insane.
quite a strong back then. So since its inception, people would you separate your threats. It's an important concept for the deck especially when they have passive effects that gain value over time.
Yep.
So it sort of makes the opponent choose: do I take this one out? Do I take this one out? It's like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. But those cards are great when you're ahead. If you don't have a board because you don't play a lot of minions in your deck, it's not unreasonable to think you're going to be behind often. And when you have situational spells like Ghost Lightning, like 8 Gates, they depend on being together in the hand at the same time very often, or 8 Gates and Phoenix Fire, or having the spells when you had time to equip Blood Rage Mask or to get the Four Winds out. Or the Onyx Bear Seal can just be a dead card. Spiral Technique is only useful turn 7 or later, and sometimes it's you haven't dealt sufficient damage to justify its inclusion at that point. You can start out with Heaven's Eclipse in the starting hand. There are a lot of ways that the deck is just going to have too many situational cards, fall behind early, and then not win. It still maintains bad matchups against almost every Lion-R variant that's out there. Most Magmar variants, especially if they run any sort of artifact destruction. And Blood Tier Alchemist is fairly common for synergy with Metamorphosis these days.
Rampant.
Yeah, rampant is a reasonable word.
It's everywhere.
So it still, it still has, it certainly is probably the stronger of the mirror decks at the moment, because Four Winds is difficult for like a backstab Songhai to deal with, and that represents, and healing has always been sort of the key to who wins the mirror match. And against Vanar, you also still do reasonably well because the decks tend to rely on Jack's True Sight as a common win condition,
Right.
and when 1 mana Ghost Lightning removes their 6 mana,
Exactly.
that's how you get ahead, and then you snowball, and very oftentimes win from there. So it's a good deck, but not top tier.
So I just quickly like to hear from all 3 of you guys, actually, just briefly, what you think about the usage of Chakri Avatar that we've seen like spike a little bit. Do you think it's what do you make of it? Let's start with the Proto quickly. Your thoughts on Chakri Avatar in these lists?
It's funny. That was actually my first. It was like the first thing I wanted to test was like after we saw the fall of Keeper and Twilight Sorcerer was something Chakri Avatar centric. But when you look at the card and what it's doing and what you have to do to make it playable, and then you look at your hand size after you're done, and then you look at your opponent's hand size, and you look at your board, and then you're just like, yeah, all right, I could probably be doing better stuff with my time. But yeah, I don't think it's any better than it was before, and I definitely wanted to try it. It was tested and definitely weeded out in the process of like 2 hours. So I don't know. I don't think it's very good, but we'll see.
Nankert, what's your take on it? You've been watching Zooch stream quite a bit, and he's been loving those Chakri Avatars. I'm sure you have something to say about that.
Yeah, obviously it's a card which, with the right combination of spells in your hand and enough mana, which can just deal huge amounts of damage. But with that said, you need those spells in your hand, you need the Chakra Avatar in your hand, and most of the time you need the Inner Focus in your hand. And you also need the mana, of course, which makes it really situational. As said before, that many parts of the spell high decks are situational, and yeah, that's it's just not universally playable in the decks right now.
Scientist, your take on it? Do you think it's something that should be played? Do you think it's there as an extra sort of win condition, or just a sudden burst to get the opponent within range? Is it good? Is it bad? What's your take?
It's a very interesting card. Certainly, it's another instance where you get a lot of use out of your cheap spells, the Mana Vortex if you have Saber Spines and so forth. And what it can do is, because it's cheap, allow you to generate multiple threats on the same turn. So like when you can drop a Mana Forger and a Chakra Avatar and then play a couple spells on like 5 mana or something like that, then it's a very powerful combination. But again, it's super situational because it requires these exact cards in your hand at the right time together to be useful, and you don't run a lot of other board control stuff. So I don't know, it just furthers the inconsistency of the deck, which is like something I vehemently dislike in any sort of deck building. So while it looks cool sometimes, like I'd rather just barely win like 65% of the time than like blow people out 64% of the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, fair enough. That makes quite a lot of sense. So before the Mask of Shadows nerf, then I think we can safely say that Songhai was very solid, really up there in terms of tier rankings for the top dog contenders in the meta. And now, post Mask of Shadows nerf, even with some innovation going on with the lists, where do you guys put Songhai now? Let's start with Proto.
Especially now, I think I would further maintain that all of the decks just suck. Like it's not really a, like, you can make a tier list out of you can make a tier list out of just about anything, right? But at the end of the day, I don't know. I would have no idea where to put it exactly.
Strong,
and I don't.
Strong, average, or mediocre?
Mediocre, definitely. But I would call everything mediocre right now. So you know what I mean? Like you could probably make a good case for it being, like tier 2 or something like that. I don't see it doing anything better than Abyssian right now, or any. You know what I mean? Like the card quality has just fallen off so much, and the creatures are so mediocre. Our artifact synergy is gone. I literally was looking at our Discord, and Scientist had posted a list, like there's like a bunch of ranged minions and Sworn Avengers and stuff, and I was like, hey, this is pretty cool. And like, you know, I was just like playing it, and I was playing it, and I was like, oh my god, like, is this what Songhai has become? Like, I have to just play a bunch of shitty ranged minions like all the time, and just like hustle and bustle around to each corner of the map, like dropping Easter eggs and like fucking trying to ping my opponent out. Like, Jesus Christ, how the mighty have fallen, dude. Like, it was crazy. Yeah, that's
so Naggart strong, average, mediocre.
Mediocre. Like you can make viable lists in S rank, but they're not top tier anymore, and they're just not as consistent as they were before the recent nerfs.
Scientist?
I'd also like to point out, I certainly didn't feel Songhai was tier 1 before the change. I felt like they were maybe third or fourth best faction, even, because they were very counterable. And yes, they had a very defining, powerful playstyle, but they were counterable. And because their game plan relied on pushing their agenda, they oftentimes didn't have a lot of built-in answers, and that left them susceptible if they ever fell behind. So they were, I don't know, I don't think they were. And I'd also like to echo Proto's sentiment about if you ask any top tier player before, they did not think a Mask of Shadows change was warranted. It was a fun card, like it was a defining mechanic. And
It certainly
I'm
was.
sad to have seen it just go go the way of the dodo bird.
Now, if we were having that conversation back when Old Lantern Fox was still a thing, I was definitely listening, right? Like
Yeah.
it was like 2
Yeah.
mana 8
Yeah, for
damage. I'm
sure.
threatening this positioning. Like everybody's answer to it is sit against the wall. Like that's gonna do anything. Like I don't know, man. It was definitely worth a consider. Like yeah, it was a conversation worth having in the past, but now it just felt kind of unnecessary.
Okay, so let's move on to last couple of things here for today's show. We've had this announcement of a big patch, and I think seeing as Proto has taken a break, it's time to put him back in the hot seat momentarily. Proto, do you have any prediction for where you think the game is heading? The designers told us that we should be expecting a big patch. You got a prediction?
Now, direction the game is heading in terms of like speed, balance. Can I get a little more direction than?
Actually, why don't you touch on each of those briefly?
Okay.
Why not?
Well, it's worth noting that as silly as it may seem, I brought this up in the past. How they had on the front page that the primary draw for me, at least when I was sold, the game was sold to me by other people. I was like, all right, like really convince me. Like I'm a Hearthstone player. What do I want out of this game? What can it offer me? And it was a fast-paced strategy game that was centered around a lack of RNG and really skill-intensive play. And I was like, all right, I can get behind this. They have since removed the fast-paced wording on their manifesto on the front page, which I find interesting.
Did they?
But
Did they actually
did.
remove it?
They actually did. That is not a joke. So I don't mind. However, I was very thrown by the fact that this new direction that they're heading, that they have been heading the last 3 or 4 months, had taken place right when they were doing a marketing campaign for the game. Through the Hearthstone streams and advertising on other websites and stuff like that. The game was getting a lot of good praise, like a lot of good press. Everybody was liking it, aside from the same vocal minority that felt that X card was OP at X time, and will always continue to say the same things and the same consistency and the same percentage. Like it never changes. I was very comfortable with where the game was heading, because when you say that you're making a fast-paced strategy game, it sort of implies a couple things. Most notably, if you are actually doing it, like you're doing it big, you're doing it right, and they were for a while, in my opinion. Like for me, at least. This view changes from person to person. Obviously, it's not like opinion presented as fact or anything, but it sort of implies that you can withstand a certain amount of pressure being put on by your community to make it more fair or whatever, like more equal footing. Because like if the better players are winning more often, I'm always comfortable with that. Like that's never something that I would like think to change. And in that sense, I thought the game was very fun to play, especially when I first started 4 months ago, before all of this really started like changing.
So that's in terms of like pace, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like how fast the game was, how potent your decision making was in those turns. And it's interesting that Scientist actually is working on talking about how fast the game will be now because of the decisions that have been made with regards to the game. But anyways, it's hard for me to like look at the game as Duelyst now. It's weird. I really enjoyed it, and I still do, but it's just not the same thing. It's not the game that I was sold previously, and I think it'll just take some time for me to like get back into it, like in the same way that I was before. I don't know.
It might mean you're gonna have to play a different faction.
Maybe I might have to. It seems that way. But at the same time, if all of the classes feel that bad, I think I probably want to play the faction that I'm best at.
That's fair enough. In terms of balance, just briefly, do you think we're in a good spot at the moment? Do you think that the patch that they're gonna drop is gonna improve balance in the game?
Improve balance. I think it's easy to disguise a pool of cards that are all like pretty low in power level as balanced, and I think I've long maintained that diversity is one of the most overrated meta states in like any card game. As long as like the better player is winning the majority of the time, like a vast majority of the time, I would say, and it's just like a fun, skill intensive, like reflex oriented environment. It just works out better for all the players involved, and I understand. I totally understand why they've done what they've done. They've really taken a hammer to like improve the game experience for the vast majority of the people that aren't the top tier crowd, and that's respectable. I find it odd that they did it at such a time in the game's development where they needed like they had sold a different game to the people that were watching, and I think it's become apparent through the viewership and the Reddit response that that's something that people noticed. But yeah, as far as the balance goes, I think we can only go up from here, if I'm being honest. Like I don't see the game. I don't think it can get any more bland than it is now, and I think that's totally fine. Like if they had to take a chisel to the proverbial ice block that was the game's design, I think I don't think now is the time to do it. I think it was time to do it before the game was being advertised to a large audience, and I would have liked to see some more things be put, like have like some sort of anchoring mechanism to the players that were coming into the game, like tournament spectator, something really, anything that wasn't just like a digit on the end screen that like kind of gave you an idea of how good you were. So
Right.
I don't know. That's just kind of my 2 cents. But I think we can only go up. That's worth noting.
Scientist, do you have anything you'd like to comment on? That from what Proto was just saying, is there anything that sticks out to you particularly that you'd like to comment on?
I agree with a lot of what he said. It feels, even though it's balanced and there's diversity, it does feel a little bland. I conceptually disagree with constantly nerfing things. I feel providing more answers or giving the weaker factions more power cards to bring them relevant is like a more fun way to design the game. And like, yes, you have to worry about things like power creep and so forth, but like I don't know. It feels like we're heading towards just too many weak cards in my mind. And I'm also slightly obliged to acknowledge now that since Proto brought it up, I am aware of the change that's coming up, and I did not discuss this with anyone. He only asked me about.
We don't know, guys. We don't know.
Yeah. He asked me about. He brought up the point that they had removed the fast-paced from their title, and I had mentioned that my personal opinion is that the game is going to be more fast-paced.
Okay. So if I could ask you a question here, then, Scientist, if there is something that you would like to see, a direction you'd like to see the game improve in going forward, one thing, what would it be? And if you could maybe also complement and contrast that with one thing that you wouldn't like to see in the game going forward.
Yeah, so I think they mentioned in the announcement that they're doing massive rebalancing, which is something I'm very much looking forward to, since it feels like, and this is a complaint across all levels, that there's a significant homogeneity to all the games because there are only so many playable cards at each mana slot, faction specific or neutral. And I believe Kolos and Udamanga did a video discussing this, and they detailed it a little more significantly than I'm going to here. But essentially, a lot of the same 2-drops are played, a lot of the same 4-drops are played, and I'm hoping that with a significant rebalancing, that there will be many more cards to choose from at each spot, and just little tweaks will allow you to find a lot of new synergies with faction. Well, spells are only in the faction, but faction spells that are just like not quite good enough yet. But if there is another playable card that is good enough, it can suddenly justify its inclusion. If you think like just take a random example, Consuming Rebirth is a really interesting card, right? In my opinion, like it's typically always been played with Sarlacc, but there are a lot of other cards with Dying Wish that it's like maybe for 2 mana, it's worth it to trigger that effect. Like Reaper of the Nine Moons doesn't quite work because of the way the spawns work. But if you think about like Vorpal Reaver, that's an interesting one where you can get the Deathwatch, the Dying Wish trigger and get all those Wraithlings, and then you get the +1/+1 for the next turn. But that's a little too slow. So anyway, that's just an example where that card, if there are more Dying Wish cards that just get a little bit better, you could probably build a deck around like Dying Wish, and then have Consuming Rebirth become like a 3-of and a really interesting component of deck design. So to answer the second part, one of the things I am, you asked one of the things I would not like to see the game move towards. Yeah. So a couple things I really like about the game are the board state, the replace mechanic, the draw. All these things I think are like fundamental, and basically allow you to one the board coming from a chess background. It makes it like positioning is a huge mental component of the game, and is one of the primary features that separates like every tier of player. And then the way the draws and replace mechanic operate, it allows you to build decks for consistency because you can reliably play card combos. And I would actually love to see more combination style decks. Even though Lantern Fox seemed quite a bit oppressive, I think it was more a combination of having too many oppressive cards at the same time. Like I wish Dagger Kiri combo was more viable, and I wish other decks had combinations that could be played. Like I really like Frosthorn Rhino and Spirit of the Wild, even though it's just a 2-card combo. You can spend all your other turns sort of setting it up by dictating the positioning of the play. So anyway, I would love to see more combinations in the game.
Okay. Nankard, how about you? I mean, if there's something you would like to see change in the game going forward, what would it be? And something that you wouldn't like to see?
Yeah, the part I want to see in the future in the game is like something scientists said as well, is making more cards viable for deck building and having a more diverse deck building aspect. So that becomes more of a thing, that deck building becomes more and more important, especially with infection minions and spells. And as a point I don't want to see is like the RNG part to increase here, which it did previously with like Keeper, or even though it's not played on a competitive level with Chimera, for example. So I'd like to see them move away from these aspects a bit.
Okay. Well, guys, I've got to thank you for taking the time out to be on the show today. We really appreciate it. And it's always great to hear and get some different perspectives, just to get people thinking about how they feel about the game and what they'd like to see going forward, and hopefully to get vocal about it. And I think one of the greatest things to get going in a community is to stimulate a dialogue. We don't all have to think about things the same way, but getting more information, different perspectives can only help to make the game better. And if you feel strongly about something and you feel that you can make a decent argument for it in a constructive way, make your opinion heard. People are listening. Thank you very much, Scientist. Thanks, Protohype. Thanks to my co-host, Nangert. We'll catch you guys next time. Latest.
Laters.
See you guys.